My fiance and I have been living together in a small one-bedroom apartment for nearly 4 years. While our time in that cramped and somewhat rundown apartment was filled with fond memories, it was time to look for a more permanent means of residence. Laura always had this vision, a dream home in her mind. She wanted a massive house with multiple rooms and areas to furnish and decorate. While that prospect edged on fantasy, especially with our meager incomes, I never stopped her from dreaming about her perfect home. Since our work schedules were quite different, we often found ourselves house hunting on the days the other worked. During the in-between time, we would show each other potential places and debate over whether or not we both liked it. Eventually, our lease was nearing its end, and threatening renewal or forcing our hand on a place. We ended up going with the latter. It was one of the few locations we could both agree upon. It was a medium-sized house on the other side of the city. It wasn't a massive drawback in terms of work commute, as we both had to travel the same distance regardless. We set up a meeting with the realtor and did a walkthrough shortly thereafter. The exterior of the house was unassuming. Plain white siding that had been fading in places adorned the outside. The front lawn was sizable but ultimately mimicked every other house on the street. The neighboring houses were spaced apart quite a bit. This was a major plus in my book. I don't need nosy or noisy neighbors interrupting my personal life. Stepping inside, I looked to Laura to gauge her reaction. She was all smiles throughout the meeting. The realtor showed us everything apart from the attic. The 2 side bedrooms were decent. The master bedroom was lavish. Living room a tad on the small side. To put it bluntly, it was your run-of-the-mill 3-bedroom home. As we were examining the kitchen and discussing how she would arrange all of our appliances, I glanced over and saw an innocuous door, which sat in between the living room and the kitchen. I asked the realtor if this was some pantry of some kind, and she remarked that the door descended into the basement. My curiosity was piqued instantly. Laura chatted up the realtor while I opened the door and stared down at the plain wooden steps. Reaching over for the light switch, a dull yellow glow stretched from the top of the stairs to the bottom. I would hear the wood softly creak under my footsteps as I descended. When I reached the bottom, I turned and found another light switch. Upon flipping it, the entire room was bathed in fluorescent lighting. The floor had brand new carpeting. The walls seemed freshly painted, with nice trimming around the ceiling and floor. The whole area was quite sizable. I was almost consumed by the thoughts of possible uses this basement could have. Then I was promptly pulled from my contemplative state by Laura, who was now standing behind me. She asked me what I thought. I nodded and told her that I wouldn't mind this place if she was okay with it too. She nodded in return, gave me a kiss on the cheek, and we began the somewhat tedious process of purchasing the house. The first night in this place was incredible. It was almost jarring just how quiet this place was. No neighbors walking around or listening to music on the other side of thin walls. It was like our very own slice of paradise. Over the months that followed, we slowly furnished the house as best we could, and we couldn't have been happier. Then, about a year after we had moved in, something strange began to take place. Laura had begun waking me in the middle of the night, claiming she was hearing strange sounds coming from the house. By the time I'd stir from my deep sleep and listen, I wouldn't hear a thing. She'd tell me it sounded like someone was walking around in the living room. I'd get up, of course, and investigate her suspicions, and find nothing amiss. This didn't happen every single night. It only happened maybe once or twice a month at most. I was convinced it was just her having a bad dream, and that dream was spilling into reality when she awoke. Then, one day when Laura was at work, I heard the noise for myself. I was sitting in one of the spare bedrooms that I had converted into a rec room. I was watching yet another episode of a show I had completed numerous times. A soft thud drew my attention. I quickly turned on the TV in the room and paused for a moment. I knew I had heard something, but wasn't entirely sure what. After a long 5 minutes, I was about to resume my show when a new noise echoed from down the hall. The distinct sound of a door closing, the metal latch snapping shut. I felt a wave of nerves beginning to build up within me. Laura shouldn't have been home for another few hours. Thinking she had come home early, I called out to the empty house asking if she was here. I waited and waited. No response. I got up from my chair and slowly walked out into the living room. I looked around and the entire house was empty as far as I could tell. I called out once again, and again. Nothing but silence returned to me. Then my eyes drifted over to my basement door. I had been planning on converting my basement into a larger rec room of its own, but all it ended up becoming was just a giant storage space. I pulled open the door and glanced down. There was no sign of anything down there. I turned on the light and the dull glow crept down the stairs. I walked down and flipped the second switch, and the room ignited in a pale fluorescent glow. I looked over the pile of boxes and leftover furniture. Nothing was out of place. Then my eyes saw something which didn't make any sense at all. There was the outline of a door frame, hiding behind a stack of boxes. This sent a wave of confusion pulsing through me, as I had been down here multiple times, and the only door to this basement was at the top of the stairs. The water heater and fuse boxes weren't even located down here, so there was no reason for a second door to even exist. I walked over to it and pushed the boxes further away from the door. I examined it for a moment and sure enough, there was a second door inside my basement. I reached down and stupidly turned the knob, and with an almost gasping sound, the door popped open. I pushed the door inward and looked around. It was utterly lightless inside this space. Warning signals were firing in my mind, screaming at me to shut the door and go back upstairs. However, a different part of my brain took over and decided the best thing to do was to ask if anyone else was here. As soon as those words left my lips, a heavy stillness lingered in the air before I heard something. A voice that sounded pained and faint, like a distraught whisper. I am here. The light from my basement was barely penetrating this new area, and through the shadows, a face appeared. It looked like a mannequin. Rough plastic in place of flesh, cracked and chipped in various places. The way it moved into the light was so terrifying. It reminded me of the nurses from Silent Hill. It just twitched and convulsed, drawing closer and closer to me. Its eyes were hardened plastic and lifeless, yet its mouth hung open. Dry gasps and wheezes emanated from its plastic lips. It raised a stiff arm towards me, and in a flash, it lunged at me. The speed it began moving was unlike anything I had ever seen before. Thankfully, my hand was still on the doorknob, and the previous part of my brain that was telling me to leave finally took over, and I slammed the door shut in its face. I spun on my heels and threw the massive pile of boxes down in front of the door. I darted to the stairs and sprinted up them, slamming the basement door behind me in the process. Laura came home a few hours later to find me installing a latch on the basement door, so I could lock it from the outside. She asked me what I was doing, but I couldn't seem to find the words to explain to her that a mannequin monster tried to attack me. Instead, I just mentioned that I saw a rodent or something in the basement, and didn't want it getting into the house. She scoffed at me and opened the door. She said that the poor thing was probably lost and wanted to be let loose outside. I cautioned her from going down into the basement, but she descended anyway. Not wanting anything bad to happen to her, I joined her, and we both descended the steps. She looked around and said she didn't see any rodents. and I just returned a silent nod because I was staring at the faint outline in the painted wall on the other side of the basement. An outline where that second door previously stood. It was gone. We both returned to the living room and I finished screwing in the lock. I convinced Laura that it was to help me sleep better at night, and she eventually came to understand. Ever since I installed that lock on the door, we haven't heard a single strange noise coming from anywhere in the house. Eventually, a month passed, and I was just starting to chalk the whole experience up to my imagination. However, sometimes, when I'm walking through my living room and I pass by my basement door, I hear a strange sound coming from behind it. It's faint, and unless the house was silent, you might not hear it. But the sound is unmistakable. It is the sound of something scratching on the other side of the wooden door. It's been a little over a month and a half since I've started to hear that faint scratching sound. And I'm not sure how to tell Laura this, but I've already started looking for a new place to live.